We're going to begin with Deuteronomy 17, and just kind of getting the larger picture. What we're getting here is we're getting a kind of picture of Israel's social structure. So we've kind of looked at Judges thus far. We'll see a little bit more about that social structure. We've also heard a little bit about Kings, more about that in a minute. But we just want to remember why social structure is so important. And I think it's really important to kind of see it in this light. That is, the question here, and there's a parallel question with the church, right? How does Israel maintain her religious integrity? How does that happen over time, right? And the idea here is that the structure that God gives his people, this interesting combination of judges, priests, kings, we'll see some other folks later on. The central job of all these people is in one way or another to help Israel maintain her integrity over time, because that's not going to happen automatically. Same issue for the church, right, which is another question, which we don't need to address right now. But in Deuteronomy 17, we begin by looking at sacrifices. We've seen those a little bit before. I just want to note one thing. Look at what 17:1. We're going to be a little selective with this section, but you shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep in which a blemish or any defect whatever, for that is an abomination to the Lord your God. So notice here, remember I've tried to make the point that the purpose of sacrifice is not to kill animals. And the purpose of sacrifice is not for God to be taking things from his people and, almost like a assertion of power, right? I can take this, I can take that. Rather, we've seen that the basic focus, the basic function of sacrifice is that the people take what creation has given them, and they offer it to God, and that sort of is a way of keeping the creator-creature relationship intact, okay? With every sacrifice, essentially you're reminding yourself that you are a creature, you are not the creator. And therefore there's this important relationship that is there. So now we have a law, a provision, which says that you can't offer blemished animals to God. That is, you can't look at your herd or whatever you happen to have, right, and say, God's really blessed me. I need to sort of do something to remind myself that, everything I have is a blessing from God. There's that sheep back there that only has 3 legs and looks like it's going to fall over dead any minute now. I think I'll offer that. Nothing imperfect or defective can be offered to God. Think about that for a moment, right? You never offer to God that which is defective, second best, anything like that. We've already seen this enacted in a really important way, right? Because remember, when they're building the tabernacle, remember the building materials that are used for it? Everything is the best. Gold or silver, bronze, the best fabric, the best craftsmanship, right? The thing that's used to build God's dwelling place on earth is, everything is the best. And the same here with sacrifice. Now, there's going to be a couple things we want to think about right here, right? There's a hidden sort of theological nugget here in 17:1 that we don't want to forget, right? We want to remember that the ultimate sacrifice is offered on Good Friday. And that sacrifice, too, is unblemished, perfect. Okay, so we just want to track with that idea. The other thing, Paul's going to address this in Romans 12, 1 through 2, right? Paul's going to tell us that that in a very real sense, right, we in the new covenant, the sacrifice that we offer is ourselves. And that means, right, we always want to offer our best. We never want to offer to God, like in prayer or worship in our daily living, that which is like second best. So a really important principle here that we want to take seriously. Now, a little bit more on Israel's social structure. So this is Deuteronomy 17, starting at verse 8. Here we have some more about Israel's legal system. I'll just go ahead and read it to you. If any case requiring decision between one kind of homicide and another, one kind of legal right and another, or one kind of assault and another, any case within your towns that is too difficult for you, that is too difficult for the local judge, then you shall arise and go to the place that the Lord your God will choose, eventually Jerusalem, and you shall come to the Levitical priests and to the judge who is in office in those days, and you shall consult them, and they shall declare to you the decision. Then you shall do according to what they declare from you from that place that the Lord will choose, and you shall be careful to do according as they direct. So notice here, this is what I call, this is like an appeals court, okay? Local judge, there's some issue, right, that's maybe too complicated or too difficult for the local judge to deal with, or maybe you've questioned their decision. So there's a court of appeal, and in this case, the court of appeal are those who serve in the tabernacle, the priests, the sons of Aaron. So we're learning a little bit more about their role. We've seen a little bit about some of the things they do already. We are now also seeing that Aaron and his sons also serve as kind of like a court of appeal. Later on, their role is going to be supplemented by the king. So kings will actually hold court, and of course this is where the idea of the royal court comes from. Not just a bunch of people, a bunch of people in fancy clothes sitting around looking important, but actually holding a court where the king actually makes judgments about, this, that, or the other. But here we have now the Levitical priests, right? And this actually makes sense, right? Because they're the experts in the law of Moses. So who better to sort of handle these really difficult cases? So they kind of function as Israel's Supreme Court, in effect, in addition to other things that they do. But notice what's going on here. There's a concern here that important legal decisions be made properly. And if something is too complex, right, if something is beyond the competency of the local judge, which of course is not inconceivable, right, then there has to be an avenue of appeal to make sure that this gets done right. And once again, right, the idea here is the purpose of all this is to inculcate a respect for justice in Israelite society. So it's a really important idea. Now, in 1714, we have laws concerning kings, and of course at this point we're going to say, hey, wait a minute, why do we have a law concerning kings when we don't even have a king yet? Okay, we're not going to get one until 1 Samuel even, and that means we have to walk through, Joshua and Judges to sort of get there, and we know what happens on the way through that little journey, right? That's why it's important that, the book of Judges concludes, right, with that kind of crotchety remark, right? There was no king in the land, and therefore every man did what was right in his own eyes. Okay, that's the idea. Obviously, a sort of very pro-monarchical view, right? And after that, they all broke out and sang, God Save the King, right? Anyway, let's take a quick look at 1714 and following. So here we have a provision now for understanding the monarchy when it in fact comes. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the other nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose, one from among your brothers. You shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. So a non-Israelite can't be a king, for obvious reasons. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself any excessive silver and gold. Now get this is really important. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, the book of Deuteronomy, approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of the law and all these statutes and doing them. So a couple really important things there. And then I want to say a few words about 1 Samuel 8, which this is looking to. Now, this section here is actually probably looking forward or looking at a specific king. In this warning, okay, the king, your king, shouldn't acquire many horses. And of course, remember here, right, horses aren't just, Kentucky Derby things. Horses are military animals. Okay, so your king is not to have like a huge army. And your king is also not to acquire many wives. More about that in a minute. And is not to accumulate excessive silver or gold. Obviously, right, these are all things that Solomon actually does. Okay? Lots of horses, lots of wives, all foreign, lots of silver, lots of gold, huge yacht, vacation houses all over the place, immense stock portfolio, whole 9 yards. What's going on here? Well, I think something really important is going on here, and that is, and this shouldn't be surprising, right? Okay, you are going to have a king. There'll come a moment when you'll want one. But let's get straight about something. The kind of king you have will be unlike any of the others. The kind of king that you have needs to be the kind of king that's appropriate to kind of the people you are. And that means he's going to have to renounce the 3 major forms of power most valued in the ancient world. Military power, horses. Sexual power, wives. Financial power, silver and gold. Now think about that for a minute. Once again, right, there's a theological gem hidden here. We're looking forward to the fact that Israel's king is going to be unlike any other. And so, guess what happens when Israel's true king, who, as we all know, is Jesus, remember what he does as he's about to enter into Jerusalem on what we now call Palm Sunday? Remember the animal on which he rides? He deliberately chooses to ride in on a donkey, a domestic animal, not a horse, a war animal. And remember, as he comes in, right, Matthew quotes Zechariah 9:9. Behold, O daughter of Zion, behold, your king comes to you humble and riding on a donkey, a beast of burden. Here's the real king who has renounced military power, sexual power, and financial power, because he is himself the power of God. He's Israel's true king. So it's really important to kind of read these things very carefully. This will also be a sort of standard of judgment by which Israel's kings get judged, and that's why, if you've read like 2 Kings, you'll remember like this recurring thing, right? And so became king, and he did what was wrong in the eyes of the Lord, and he lived for so many years, and thankfully he died. And then his son became king, and he did what was wrong in the eyes of the Lord, and thank goodness, he only reigned for 3 years, and it goes on and on. But notice what else happens. This is Deuteronomy 17:18. This to me was like one of the most kind of like shocking kind of verses in the Old Testament. When the king comes, right, when you get a king, the first thing the king's going to need to do is this, not make a great speech or even have like a coronation or anything like that. The first thing that the king's going to need to do is he's going to need to sit down on his throne. And he himself is going to write out a copy of the whole book of Deuteronomy, so that what that book says is firmly implanted in his royal mind, and so that he will be mindful of what his obligation as King of Israel is. If you watch the coronation of Charles III, you may have noticed there's sort of an echo of this gesture. Charles didn't sit down and write out the book of Deuteronomy. That would have taken a long time. But you may remember that at one point, right, there was a person, I think he was from the Church of Scotland, handed the king a Bible with words to this effect: "Your Majesty, receive this book. It contains the most valuable thing that this mortal life affords." And of course, what is that? The wisdom of God, right? That is, you're not becoming king just to like do any darn thing that you want to do. You have an obligation, right? You're about to be anointed in a Christian religious ceremony. Take this book and be very mindful of what it says. So this is something that's just like utterly unique in the ancient world, right? In all the other countries, in all the other civilizations around Israel, right? Kings pretty much did whatever they want. They had a lot of power, right? They kind of strove to do whatever they want. Not so in Israel. Okay, Your Majesty, you're going to sit your royal rear end down in that chair, and you're going to take your royal little hand and you're going to copy this whole book out like you were in 3rd grade. Copy the whole darn book of Deuteronomy. And as you copy it out, hopefully, right, some of that book will sink into your royal mind and you'll be mindful of what you're supposed to do. So that's really important. I just want to call your attention to something that happens in 1 Samuel 8. It's a really important scene, so I'm going to read part of it to you. This is the inauguration of Israel's monarchy, but it's kind of an interesting scene in a number of ways. This is 1 Samuel 8:1. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons, this is really important, his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. That is, Samuel's sons did the very thing Deuteronomy says judges are not supposed to do. They took bribes. They were corrupt. They were undermining Israel's whole system of justice. And so here's what the people say. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. This is serious, but also it's kind of like humorous in a way. All the elders gathered together. They come to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like the other nations." Okay, Samuel, let's get 2 things straight. First of all, thing number 1, you're an old geezer. You got one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel. You're not long here. So we need a replacement for you. And your replacement ain't going to be to your 2 boys because they're rotten. So, what we want is we want a king. Then Samuel gives the people a warning about what the king might do. And this should sound familiar. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. And he said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you." This is a literal description of Solomon. These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run after his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and some to reap his harvest. and to make his implements of war and the equipment for his chariots, and he will make your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive orchards, and he will take your servants, and he will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards he will give to his officers and servants, and it goes on and on and on. That is in effect, right? Samuel says, y'all need to watch out, because if you're not careful, the monarchy could become just like all the other ones and become sort of a giant economic suction hole, which vacuums everything in the nation up for its own purposes. That's not what you want, right? So that's, once again, Samuel's warning. Now in Deuteronomy 18, we get to finally Deuteronomy's provision for the Levitical priests. So let me take a look. So we've got judges. We've seen a glance at priests in terms of their judicial function. We've gotten a glance at kingship. Now we're coming back to Israel's priests and something about them. So here it is, 18:1. The Levitical priests, all the tribe of Levi, shall have no portion or inheritance with Israel. They shall eat the Lord's food offerings as their inheritance. They shall have no inheritance among their brothers. The Lord is their inheritance, as he promised them. And this shall be the priest's due from the people, from those offering a sacrifice, whether ox or sheep, and they shall be given to the priest the shoulder of the 2 cheeks and the stomach, the first fruits of your grain and your wine and of your oil, and the first fleece of your sheep you shall give to him. For the Lord your God has chosen him out of all your tribes to stand as ministers in his name of the Lord, him and his sons for all time. That's what's going on here. The Levites, these are all members of the tribe of Levi, and now specifically the sons of Aaron. They are Israel's priests. We've seen their ordination back in the book of Exodus. We've gotten bits and pieces about their role here, but something about them that's said here is really important. The Levites, Israel's priesthood, is to own no land whatsoever. In other words, in effect, the Levites take what we would call a vow of poverty. All right, then this is a world, right, an agricultural world where land is wealth. Land doesn't consist in, stock portfolios and mutual funds and bonds, because none of that's been invented yet. Wealth is land. And the sons of Levi, Israel's priests, don't have a square centimeter of it. This is really important because we know in the ancient world, in Egypt, in Rome, in Mesopotamia, Babylon, on and on and on, temples and priesthoods owned like vast tracts of land and were immensely wealthy. So wealthy that eventually temples began functioning as banks, which was why there was a period of time, right, where banks were built to look like temples. They're not built that way anymore. They're all ugly. Okay, they all look like, they don't look like banks, right? But it used to be like, the downtown First National Bank, right, had like pillars, and it looked like solid and, impressive, and it was made out of granite, and you like felt comfortable putting your money there, not, some kind of, ugly building in some strip mall somewhere, that's all gone. Anyway, Israel's priesthood is to be utterly different than any other priesthood, just like Israel's monarchy is to be utterly different than every other monarchy. And that is, Israel's priesthood is to be completely dependent on the people of Israel. And the reason for that is that Aaron and his sons serve the people of Israel in the tabernacle, and therefore their livelihood is completely dependent on the offerings of the people of Israel. They own no land. They're not vastly wealthy. They're not powerful and have huge fortunes piled up. That's all ruled out. So we have a very, very different kind of priesthood here in Israel that goes with a very, very different kind of monarchy. Now, let's take a look quickly at Deuteronomy 18:9 in the English Standard Version. This section is called abominable practices. Okay, and that kind of like attracts your attention, doesn't it? Wow, abominable practices. I wonder what they were. Okay, let's see what they were. And once again, this makes sense, right? The context right here is once again the religion of the people of Canaan. So this is all warnings against all that, but it has a common theme here. When you come into the land the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. And by the way, the abominable practices that are listed here are not like the whole of the abominable practices. They're actually more. So we'll be finding out what some of those are. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or daughter as an offering. Anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes, or interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, or a medium, or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord, and because of these abominations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you, that is the native inhabitants of the land. Well, what's going on with all these different practices, right? So let's take a look at a couple of them. So one of the practices of the people in Canaan, and we'll be seeing echoes of this throughout the Old Testament, is the worship of the god Moloch, M-O-L-O-C-H. Moloch was worshipped literally by taking your firstborn child and kind of throwing them into like this fire pit. The idea here was something like this, right? Dear Moloch, I'm sacrificing to you that which is most valuable to me, and I'm expecting something in return. That's how it worked, okay? So that's ruled out, okay? None of that. Why? Well, there are a number of reasons why, right? But the big reason why we've already noted, right? And that is, as the creator, God needs nothing, and therefore it's impossible to bargain with him. Right? You can't say to the God of Israel, look, I'll do this for you if you do this for me, to which the divine reply is going to be something like, hey, pipsqueak, I don't need anything from you. Okay? So that's ruled out, and we just want to realize, right, although this sounds like awful to us, we just want to remember that this was a practice all through the land of Canaan, and at various points in its history, it's going to return to Israel again and again and again because people believed they were going to get a blessing if they did this. Okay? So we just remember that there was something greatly attractive about this practice, as awful and disgusting as it sounds to us, but God rules this out, so that's abominable. Don't do that. And then we have other things, divination, telling fortunes, interpreting omens. We've got sorcerers, charmers, mediums, necromancers, people who attempt to communicate with the dead, things like that. All these things really have one thing in common. Everything in this section basically has one thing in common, and that is, these are all ways that people try to use to, in some way, shape, or form, either determine the future or learn something about it. Okay? And of course, these are all ruled out. Why? Number one, what is the only possible and conceivable source of blessing in the entire universe? God. Are there other sources of blessing that you might appeal to? No. So why bother? Okay, there's thing number one. Thing number two, if we're constantly trying to sort of, learn what the future might bring, or even try to sort of like control it, what does that say about us? One of the things that it says about us, right, is regardless of what we might say, we don't really trust God. So all these things that are being talked about here, in your handout, I refer to them as spiritual technologies. That is, the understanding here, right, is it's not just these particular tasks, right? It's a whole understanding of religion that's at work here, right? And it looks something like this, right? The gods, the spiritual world, whatever you want to call it, right? They're sort of like Coke machines. If you put the 75 cents or the $1.50 or the $2 or the $5, if you're staying in a Hilton, if you put your $5 bill into the Coke machine and you press the button, you're going to get your Coke. And the understanding is that's how the gods in this world work. Okay? You burn your sun, I give you a fertile crop. That's the understanding here. That's not how things work in Israel. Okay? God is the only possible conceivable source of blessing. And the call of the people of Israel is not to try to sort of learn the future or control it, but to live in the trust of God's providence. So that it's like a different, like, spiritual universe. Now I think we have time for, we've got time for one more thing. This really important section here in Deuteronomy 15 is really important. So let's take a quick look at it. This is really one of the most important texts in the Old Testament. And once again, it kind of is one of these places that gives us a wonderful tie into the new. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me. This is Moses talking, by the way. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is him you shall listen. Just as you desired the Lord your God at Horeb, that is Mount Sinai, on the day of the assembly, when you said, "Let me not go near again to the voice of the Lord my God, or see his great fire, or any more, lest I die." And the Lord said to me, "They are right in what they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And whoever will not listen to my words, that he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him." So, two things here that we just want to notice. First of all, this is like a really important Old Testament promise. We have a promise of God raising up for the people of Israel a prophet like Moses. And it's really important for us to remember, right? Either from Sunday school or from Vacation Bible School or from watching Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments, right? We've gotten sort of like the idea in our minds that we need to think of Moses as the lawgiver. That's why he needs to have a deep voice, right? But the Old Testament actually doesn't think of Moses as a lawgiver at all. The Old Testament thinks of Moses and remembers him as Israel's greatest prophet. Now, here's where a little bit of language can be helpful. It's not always helpful, but it can be. The Hebrew word for prophet is directly related to the Hebrew word for mouth. The Hebrew word for prophet is nabi, which is a play on the word mouth. That is literally right. A prophet is God's mouth, God talking, right? God speaking to his people. And so God here promised, okay, look, there's going to come a time when I'm going to raise up from the people of Israel a prophet like you who will speak my words to the people of Israel. So fast forward a minute. Two things. We're going to fast forward to the Gospel of Matthew. And just remember two things, right? So there's this long sort of teaching section, right, that begins in Matthew 5. And it's called the Sermon on the Mount, right? Where we read that Jesus, before teaching, right, what does he do? He goes on to the top of a high mountain, like another important Old Testament figure, right? Moses. Only instead of saying, okay, I've been up on the mountain now for 40 days and 40 nights, and this is what God told me, here it is. Jesus just simply basically starts talking. The idea being, right, that no, I didn't hear this from God. In effect, right, I am God talking to you. Another important Matthew moment. This is in Matthew 17, right? This is the transfiguration, which we sometimes pass over, right? So remember, it's that moment where Jesus, Peter, James, and John go up to a high mountain, and Jesus' whole person is transfigured by this glorious, kind of like radiant light. Okay? It's the glory or the light of God, just like Moses saw on Mount Sinai. And remember, that's when Peter starts to kind of like babble. You know, some people when they get nervous or frightened, they just start talking and saying stuff. Of course, some people do that all the time without being nervous, right? But that's another story. So Peter starts babbling away, right, about building booths, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. And that's when basically God sort of like intervenes, and basically God says, okay, Peter, shut up. And then the voice of God says, and this is important, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. This is the prophet, like Moses, that I promised. Listen to him. So we have Deuteronomy 18 now looking forward to the coming of Christ and his ministry. Let's go ahead and stop there. We're going to get into Deuteronomy 19 next Sunday. And what we're going to see is a number of things in 19 and 20. 19, we're going to go back to the criminal justice system. And we're going to see a provision for what are called cities of refuge. And then we're going to see some important considerations about property. Property is going to be marked out with property marking stones, right? This is where my farm stops, and this is where your farm starts. Now, I know that this would never be a temptation for you, but you know what? There are some days when I'm tempted, when you're not looking, to take that stone and to move it. Just a couple inches, right? And maybe like the next week I come back and move it a couple more, right? We get a law here that, you're not supposed to do that. And there's a very important reason why. And it's something like this. To steal, either by, changing property boundaries or to operate with like improper balances where you're not giving someone like the fair change that they should be given or something like that, right? In doing this, you are obviously committing theft, but that's really not the central issue. The central issue is by taking something that belongs to somebody else, you're literally like carrying out an assault against them. Yeah, you're not actually punching them in the nose, right? But you are taking their land. Maybe, no, you're not punching the nose, but you are giving them improper change. But that's considered an assault on a person. And of course, that's sort of like on the way, as Jesus will make clear, that's on the way to murder. So that's forbidden as well. And we'll take a look at that next Sunday. We'll also take a look at Deuteronomy 20, which will get us into the conduct of war and how that's supposed to be done and how it's not supposed to be done. So we'll take up criminal justice and war next week.